So the story of Adam Hava, it's a let's kind of get into that if you can, because there's obviously the snake, the significance of the snake and them being naked and after the sin, and it seems as if they have no free will, but then when they eat from the tree of knowledge, they got free will, but wouldn't they have had free will to make that decision in the first place? So there's all these questions that you talked about this morning, but I'd love for you to explain for the audience.
Perfect. So let's actually start from the very beginning.
Mhm.
Let's start with let's say the first question. What is the etadat tovara? Man is planted in the Garden of Eden, and he's told not to eat from the tree of etadat tovara. Now, what would be that tree? What is etadat tovara? So I think all the Mefarshim, the philosophical Mefarshim, they're pretty much saying the same thing. And I think in the Rambam, it's phrased as the ability to follow tovara as opposed to emet vasheker, which would be my subjective will as opposed to what objective reality tells me is good, right? So what I determine good, I will take over what God determines is good, right? That's the way, let's say, Rambam phrased it. Now, in the Ramban, he phrases it as the capacity for free will, explicitly. He's very explicit about it, which is pretty much the same thing at the end of the day, because whenever you choose, when you have free will, it's essentially saying you have the ability to choose what you want as opposed to what is right, or as opposed to what God wants, So I think that's fundamental to understanding the story. As long as you understand that the tree of knowledge of good and bad is some kind of free will, is some kind of instrument towards free will, and the ability for man to make choices that are not in line with what was designated for them by God, then you're understanding the story correctly. Now, I'll tell you why that's so compelling. And that's because so far in creation, every single thing we've seen is something that's completely in submission to the will of God. From the celestial spheres that are going in orbit and are completely consistent, to the animals that act off instinct, there is nothing within creation, as many of the Mefarshim say as well, that doesn't do the will of God. They do what they're supposed to do, and that's it. There's only one creature in all of creation that can deviate from the script, and that's man. So if this story is going to be a story about the origin of man, and it's going to teach us something about the human condition, it's going to obviously be focusing on the one thing and the one way in which we are different. And that is our ability to choose, our mind, our self-awareness, our ability to imagine a future, and so on. Now, all of these things, they sound like they're different, but they're really all the same thing. And we'll discuss why they're the same thing a little bit. It gets very philosophical, but they're all the same thing. So now, I forgot where I was, but every single thing has a certain nature, except for man, in which man's choices are completely unpredictable. So the fact that the tree is one that's why it's so compelling to say this story is about free will, because what else is different? We're at the end of the day, there's nothing that distinguishes me from an animal more than my mental capacity, right? Or my mind and my ability to think freely and to choose freely. So it's very compelling because then the story is ordered. First, we talk about the things that are very scientifically predictable, and next we start in the first creation story in chapter Aleph. I wouldn't call them first and second, but in the more brief creation story where it just talks about Adam being created, Adam Hava, Adam right? It gives us just a snippet of what happens, but now I want to know more because I know as a reader that humans are different from animals. So the second story opens up on that point, right? So the first question to answer is what is the etadat tovara, and that's clearly something pertaining to the free will of man. And by there's something else I said in the shiur, that's why science is so much more relevant to the natural world. But whenever you get, let's say, I was talking about this with somebody else, you could predict what humans will do generally. But any individual human is free to deviate from the script of any scientific prediction. So for example, you have you can predict that when you put an addict in a certain situation, they won't be able to break their addiction, because 80% of addicts cannot break their addiction under certain circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't bar any individual human from breaking his addiction, right? His or her addiction. In the animal world, you don't see that. Every animal is almost purely is very easily predictable. You know, that otherwise they would be named, they would be known like in very individualistic ways, which they're not.
Right.
They just do what they're supposed to do. But that's again. So the point I'm making is that the fact that it makes a story very seamless to say that the discussion here of Adam and Hava is one of the distinction between man and animal, because that's what we're trying. That's what we're most naturally as readers we're most curious about. And the biggest distinction is going to be our free will. Okay. Now getting to other elements.
If I can add to that,
yeah,
the creation includes every time Hashem, a day passes, Hashem says ki tov, and he saw that it was good. But with Adam, it doesn't say that, but he's actually choosing if he's going to eat from this tree of knowledge of good and evil, right? So there's this idea. It's blatantly telling us that this is the first recorded part of history that someone has the zt'l Elohim, right? Whether you believe he was the first person on earth or whether he was the first Navi, it doesn't make a difference. The point is that this person is the first to have this decision in front of him and is able to choose. He's not like the animal kingdom, like you said. It's actually very clear, I think, in the text.
Now here, getting to the next point, I think it's made even clearer when Adam is looking for a mate. You know, unlike in the shorter creation story or the more scientific brief creation narrative that this is more of like an expansion of, Adam is made alone, right? He's built out of the ground, and there's a breath of life that's breathed into him, and he's made alone. And immediately, Borei Olam says, "Lo tov heyota Adam levado, e'aseh lo ezer kenegdo." It's not good for man to be alone. I'm going to make him a helpmate opposite him. What's interesting is that Borei Olam uses the word lo tov in this case, which, you know, according to the Ramban, tov throughout the entire creation story means something that's self-propagating, that's able to enter something once something is ready to enter into the natural cycle and just exist forever, for what we know.
Perpetual, yeah.
Perpetual, the ability to live on perpetually, that would be called tov, right? So he says, Lo tov heyota Adam levado, because he's not capable of reproducing until he has a wife. That'll be like a very interesting peshat on the word tov there. But the introduction to woman is super important, because it doesn't begin with the woman, it actually begins with the animal. Now, what Adam does to the animals is of incredible significance. I can't believe people forget that part of the story, and that's that he names the animals. So what would be the significance of him naming them? Well, the ability to name something means that you have a conceptual framework that allows you to categorize things and then give them a name that's tied to their essence. The ability to do that is uniquely human.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's tied into Adam's intelligence. So already from day one, from the very beginning of the story, we see that Adam is intelligent. Now, the question you may ask, and you've already asked it, is then the etzadat, when he eats from it, I thought that's when he gets his free will, but you're telling me he's already intelligent. So what, he's intelligent without free will originally, and that later he develops free will? I'll get to that in a second. I have my own opinion on that, but just the fact that he names the animals is extremely important, and it shows that he is more intelligent. But it's significant for another reason, and that's because this also confirms that Adam is godly, or that he has this divine spark. Because who else used speech? Who's the only other being that's been using speech so far that we know of?
Hashem.
As God in creating the world. And the creation of the world is happening through speech, because speech is representative of intelligence. And what we focus on and what we see in creation is intelligence, is divine intelligence. So there's speech involved. Speech it's a signifier of the fact that there's something going on in a mind it's a comprehending mind, you know.
Yeah.
And for Borei Olam to speak and create the world, it's already telling that there is intelligence in the creation. Now, for Adam to speak, to name animals, means that he sees the creation of God, and he's actually able to comprehend it. Now, he can't replicate it. He can't do it again, because we are always going to fall short of that level of divinity. But just to understand it enough to be able to categorize it means that maybe we can't replicate it exactly, but could we make an image in its likeness? Not trying to say we should do avodah zarah, but that's a symbol of our ability to be a little bit more divine, right? That's a symbol of our divine spark. And again, that's super important. That's extremely important. You can't miss that part of the story, that Adam is clearly intelligent, and we see that in his naming of the animal. Now, ultimately, you want to say something?
No, go ahead. Keep going.
So ultimately, he doesn't find a mate amongst the animals for obvious reasons, because it's not just a biological thing. It's not just that he can't reproduce with them. It's that there is a mental gap, and this is the Torah's way of screaming at us and saying, you are not animals. You are different, unique. You are unique, and there's no way you could ever be an animal. So don't act like an animal. But so it doesn't work with any of the animals. So then Borei Olam has to take Hava. He has to create Hava, right? And the Perush I like is the Perush that says that God took one of Adam's tzal'otav, traditionally translated as rib, but in a lot of the Mefarshim it's translated as a thigh. And this is a beautiful idea, because it's based on the midrash of the du partsufim. Familiar with that midrash? That originally Adam was created with Adam's face on one side and Chava's face on the other side, and they were just one creature.
Twins.
Right? They were Siamese twins, exactly. Yeah. And I think the idea, the will to translate tzal'otav as one of his sides is based on that midrash. It's in consonance with that midrash. Now, the midrash is again beautiful. I hope I'm not throwing too much at the same time. But the midrash is amazing, because you have Adam and Hava are one, and then they are separated, and then they turn and they face each other, right? So we already know that this story is about free will. We already know that Adam is more intelligent. And now we're coming to a part of the story in which he's finding his mate. Now, the finding of the mate is also important, and this is something that Leon Cass says, by the way. The finding of the mate is also of significance when it comes to his developing mind. Because until Adam has someone with an equal intelligence looking at him, it's very hard for him to develop any self-awareness. So the first layer of meaning here is that Adam and Hava are now facing one another, which means that Hava is looking at man and Adam is looking at Hava, and that's going to generate a lot of self-awareness, maybe self-consciousness, which is going to be part of the human condition, but it is helpful to an extent, because it much more rapidly develops that mental ability to be self-aware. To be clear why it's so important, an animal that's acting on instinct, right? I would say the self-awareness would be, let's say this is the instinct, right? Mm-hmm. And this is all the animals have, right? So the animals just do whatever they're doing, and whatever the instinct does, they do. Now, what human beings have is the ability to watch their instinct. That's a second thing, right? Call that the mind. And the mind then controls the instinct. And now, while the instinct is trying to pull the mind after it, ultimately the mind could stop it and hold on to things, right? And could control things. That mind is interrelated with self-awareness. And for that self-awareness to develop, it helps a lot for there to be social interaction, especially social interaction with a woman who's ultimately the decider of if you're going to live on through having progeny or not, right? Which makes it a much more intense experience of developing self-awareness for a man whose longevity is dependent on this woman, ultimately. Okay, so now the other reason I think the midrash of the du partsufin is so beautiful is that it tells you that ultimately man and woman should be one. A man could say, I'm self-sufficient by myself, and I could make a living, and I could be, I'm fine, I could live. So what do I need a woman for, right? And women could say the same thing. I mean, they have said it. A woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle. Have you ever heard that one? I think it was popular in like the 60s. So you could say such a thing. That's not what the Torah says. The Torah actually thinks that they should be one, and that they have complementary. They're different, but they're complementary. And the idea that they used to be one and they were separated to look at each other, but then must be reunited from the front, tells you that man by himself is only half a person. And it comes into this beautiful, deep idea that for us to really find wholeness, we need that relationship with another. Beautiful. And then now the text even goes deeper, and it says, then now man has the ability to leave his father and mother and cling to his wife, and will become of one flesh. That's an interjection of the text, but it's also very deep, because it's telling us that, in the animal kingdom, as Ramban says explicitly, an animal will go and find whatever mate it wants to find, and will bear children from very many different mates, right? It seems like the ideal in the Torah is more that a man cling to one woman and develop a bond that's beyond the physical, develop a bond that helps him develop mentally, which will develop an emotional attachment and will make the relationship capable of lasting past the will of the sexual drive, right? And that seems to be the ideal of the Torah, to create a bond of that sort, which is because if you think about it, the animal bond is purely biological, it's purely for the sake of the preservation of the species. But the human bond needs to be for the development of the mind and for the development of the soul. So it cannot just be a physical bond. It needs to be an emotional bond. And there's no better way of developing emotionally through a relationship than having a deep one, right? So that's where the Torah interjection and gives us a little bit of a shalom bayit lesson, and teaches us that your relationship with your wife should be an emotional one, and one that's going to allow you to leave your parents' house and start a house of your own. A person who's going around and is not attached to any single woman is still more attached to his parents because he has no other attachment. So by default, his attachment is the only real relationship that person has is to his parents.
I find that placement of that pasuk in the story of Adam Hava kind of it emphasizes the fact that this is a message for humanity, not for an individual person, because it's not talking about this person; it's giving us advice. So it's very nice. And then regarding so let's get back to the actions or the after effects of their sins. So Adam has to work by the sweat of his brow, and Hava, she has painful pregnancy, and the snake must eat the dust and squirm around with no legs, and he attacks men on his ankles, and he gets smacked on the head. So you gave a very nice explanation. I would love to hear that again.
Right. So they eat from the tree. It was Hava tempted into eating. Can I actually pause before we even get to the punishment and get to the snake compelling Hava to eat from the tree?
Okay. Yes.
So I think it may be the most important line of the entire story, and that is the way he tempts Hava into taking from the tree, and that is Vitem Kelohim Yodai Tov Bara. God knows that you're going to be like him, knowing good and bad, and that's a very tempting thing for Hava. It's also interesting that the snake wasn't lying. I mean, the Gemara says it explicitly, but we know because God admits that the snake wasn't lying, right? He says, God, man has become like us, knowing good and bad. This is God speaking. And he admits that what the snake says was right or was true. So then Chava eats from the tree, and and their eyes open, right? And their eyes open. What exactly compelled Chava to eat from the tree? So what you see is a lot of very interesting descriptions of the fruit. It starts with Hitova etz ma'achal. Hita'avahu la'inayim, or Hitova etz ma'achal v'chita'avahu la'inayim, and it was good lehaskil, vatikach mipriyo v'tochal. She sees that it's pleasant to the eyes, or it tastes good. It's pleasant to the eyes, and it's enjoyable to look at. I don't know exactly how to translate that part. And then she takes from the fruit. Notice that her temptation is very tied to the external or to the very superficial things of the appearance of the matter, of the fruit. The fruit tasted good and it looked good and it was enjoyable to stare at. Right? So the fact that, that's a very important thing, that it kind of teaches us that in our humanity, I think one of our biggest struggles that makes our free will difficult is that we are drawn to what our eyes see.
Mm-hmm.
This is going to be one of the biggest polemics that the Torah has, and you'll see it throughout, and that is trying to teach people to listen to or to focus on their sense of hearing as opposed to their sense of sight. It's one of those grand themes that you'll see throughout the entire Torah, like namely Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad.
Right.
Listen, Israel, that Hashem is your God.
And
don't see him, because if you try to see him, you're an Oved Avodah Zarah.
Right.
But if you listen, you can start to understand, maybe not directly, but through manifestations of God, you could get an appreciation for God's oneness. The hearing is a sense that's tied to understanding, right? You understand the spoken word, which is the spoken word of some other intelligent human. The sight, animals have sight too, right? But they can't listen. They could hear, but they can't listen. So the sense of hearing is the sense that's focused on by the Torah, and we see it already. The focus on the eyes in the way Chava fell for the trap. But there's something else that she fell for, which is Vitem kelohim yoda'et tovara. You will be like God, knowing good and bad, and that tempted her, which means it tempts us. And what is that temptation? That temptation is the basic temptation of wanting to impose our own will as opposed to God's will, or wanting to choose our own set of values as opposed to living by God's values. Or in other words, making ourselves gods as opposed to acknowledging the one God. That's what gets all of us. That's our biggest problem, And she's tempted into it by this promise of being like a God, and we all want to be like God. We all want to decide for ourselves our own morality. We all want to give in to our temptations and to give them primacy over the will of God because it's easier and it's more fun. And that also explains why the desire for power is such a deeply rooted desire within the human heart. It's brilliant that the story is already acknowledging that Chava desires to have godly strength. Vitem kelohim could mean like gods, it could also mean powerful men, it could be whatever it means. But it means something along the lines of, I want to be dominant more than, I don't want to let God be the only divinity. I want to be a divinity above and to the exclusion of God more often than not. Right? And that's what tempts Chava into taking from the tree. That's going to be one of the biggest temptations, leading her free will and man's free will astray. And it's brilliant that the Torah is already telling us far before Lord Acton told us that power corrupts absolutely. The Torah is already warning us that this is going to be one of the fundamental issues facing mankind. It's this seeking of power. Now, why we seek power gets even deeper. Should I even go into that?
Sure.
What would be like the fundamental fear that all humans have? If you were to, with every concern, let's say a person suffers from anxiety, right? So you can ask, for every anxiety he brings up, you could ask the question why. Question is, if you keep asking the question why, what will you get to at the very, very bottom of the pit? So let's say the person comes and says, I'm concerned with my business. Why? Because my business is struggling. Why does it concern you that it's struggling? Because I may not have food to eat. Why does that concern you? Because if I don't have food to eat, then I'm not going to be able to provide for my family. Okay, why does that scare you? Because ultimately, the answer is because I'm scared I'm going to die.
Yes.
It's our fear of our mortality is the ultimate concern. It's the ultimate anxiety. It's the anxiety of anxiety. It's the fear of our mortality. Again, the story speaks a lot about mortality. Maybe we could even do a second thing just discussing more of these topics. But the story talks more about mortality. It talks a lot about mortality, which also lends to the greatness of the story because it catches on to the fundamental all of the fundamental concerns that have to do with mankind, and it answers all the fundamental questions.
Right, like free will would apply to humans because we are concerned with our mortality. That's why they discovered their mortality, Adam Hava, after the sin. Whereas if you're just an animal, that doesn't even cross your mind.
Right, correct. Notice in the story that the concern for Adam and Hava eating from the tree of life is only relevant after they eat from the tree of good and bad. Because until they've developed a self-awareness and a self-consciousness and an individual identity that is built off the decisions we make and the person that we are, mortality is of no significance. We don't worry about the individual mortality of specific animals. At most, there are people out there who are concerned with the mortality of species. And even then, honestly, those people are concerned about the mortality of the species, if you really look into it, because they're scared of what it's going to do to the ecosystem, which is ultimately
how that's going to affect us.
How it's going to affect us.
Right.
So, but there's no real concern about mortality of animals, because animals, they live based on their species. I mean, their identity is lost to the identity of their species. There's nothing to die when one of them dies. Nothing unique dies. Nothing unique leaves the world. Questions of mortality only pertain to human beings because of our individualism, of our individual identities, right? And that's something the story is beautifully acknowledging, is that as Adam and Hava are becoming more and more intelligent and more self-aware, and once they eat from that tree, we start, having these fears of them living forever, which is Borei Olam's concern. But I'll tell you how you see that Adam and Hava are also concerned with their mortality, and that's in the whole part about nakedness. Leon Kass I think he's brilliant on this issue of nakedness, but the essential point is that because our biggest anxiety is our mortality, or fear of mortality, what would be the instrument through which we can fend off that mortality? It would be the sexual instruments, right? So they represent our biggest weakness, because said simply, if something goes wrong with those organs, we have no way to fight off of mortality, which means our biggest anxiety is going to come to fruition. So what do? Well, they're the source of our biggest weakness. What do we do with our weaknesses? You typically hide your weaknesses. You're not going to bring your weaknesses to a job interview. We hide our weaknesses, right? People who have big muscles, they'll show their muscles. But what about the rest of us? We hide them. We wear long sleeve shirts. So that's why we cover those organs, because they're organs that our quasi solution to our mortality. They represent our biggest weakness. They represent our biggest fears, and so we cover them up. And only once Adam and Hava eat from the tree and have completed the process of developing a self-awareness and this all of their mental capacities, does it really become an issue for them that they're naked, and they become ashamed of their nakedness. Now, another simple, I would say one notch lower in terms of complexity of the Perush, is that before they had free will, and before there was even potential to control their temptations, when temptations are part of a process like the animal world, in which it's something that's just done because it's part of the instinct, there's nothing to be ashamed of. But the second that the sexual temptation is something that I could control, the fact that it's constantly gnawing at me and trying to slip me up is something that I'm ashamed about. It represents a weakness in a different way. It represents a weakness of my inability to control my temptations, right? So that's the more traditional Perush. I think it's found also in the Ramban, that the second their ta'ava became something that was within their control, they have to cover it up, because it represents, once again, something that's not natural anymore, something that should be restrained. So we restrain it by covering it. That's another element of what the nakedness means. Ultimately, after Adam and Hava eat from the tree, then we get to the punishment. And if you want, I could start going into.
Yeah, if you have a few more minutes, I have time. So if you want to, I don't know if you have to run, but if you want to give a few minutes on that, we can end with that.
I think I'm good for a few more minutes. So
the sweating of the sweat of the brow of Adam.
Even I know I keep delaying getting to that, but I do want to address one more question you did ask, which is in terms of the sequence of events, in terms of I thought they already had intelligence at the beginning of the
Yeah.
story. So what does the significance of them eating from the tree at the end mean? So something that I want to make sure everybody understands is that the way man is created, historically, all of these concerns about our human condition, our fear for mortality, our nakedness, and all these things, these didn't happen sequentially. These are all part of us being human. These are all part of our intelligence. For example, our individual intelligence and the fact that we have an individual identity at the same time creates a concern for our individual mortality, which at the same time creates this desire to cover up our private areas, which are, our most vulnerable area. It didn't happen first, or the fact that we have the intelligence to name something didn't then turn into free will. It's all actually just part of the same complex. That's called the human mind, or the soul, or the Tselem Elohim. So when the story is breaking it out and making it into a sequence, it's doing it for us. It's doing it for us to see that there are components in that intelligence, that there are ramifications in that intelligence. This is something that's going to apply to the punishments as well. The punishments are not something that we got punished with after eating from the tree. These are ramifications of our mind. These are ramifications of us being unique and above and different from the animal kingdom. So it's something that I want to make sure people understand, is that while the story is breaking it out and starting with Adam having, speaking and categorizing animals, and then finding a woman and all these things, that's all embedded in our humanness, and it's all happening at the same time. The reason the story is doing that is to educate us into all these different layers of our humanity. And the only way to do that is to break it up and to show us piece by piece what happened and to lay it out in a story form. Right? So that's something I want to. Now, with that, I think you're going to guess that I think what these punishments are not punishments, but they are also ramifications. They are ramifications for our humanness. They're ramifications for our mental ability. And do you have any questions?
No.
So let's start with which I think is one of the more important things, and that's how the mind works. As I said, this is our instinct, right? The mouth that we've been using, that's our instinct. And then we have this mind, which is able to watch what the instinct is trying to do, right? And so you could see it as like a mind watching the instinct. Now, embedded in having a mind that watches the instinct is also an ability to, that mind that separates itself from instinct doesn't just control the instinct. That mind, at the same time that it's controlling instinct, also has within it the ability to imagine a future and to think about a past and to develop emotions tied to future thoughts and past thoughts. So what ends up happening is that you have up here, you have this very complex human mind. And then from the bottom, you have all these animal desires that are being fed into the mind, right? And those animalistic tendencies coming from our animal side, or the afar side of man, those animalistic tendencies, when they go into the human mind, they can then be augmented due to the human ability to imagine. Is that clear? Does that make any sense?
Yes.
Which means that on the one hand, the good that we could do is far greater than the good that any animal could do. At the same time, the bad that we could do is also much more intense than the bad that any animal could do, because we have the animal instinct, let's say, towards self-preservation, but we also have this complex mental ability that sits on top of it. And that desire for self-preservation could very quickly turn into a desire to kill everyone around us who may be a possible impediment to our own preservation, which would turn us into a mass murderer, right? So it's very important to realize that putting this human ability to think and to imagine a future or to imagine the past augments all of those animalistic tendencies which are there coming from the bottom, and it expands them and makes them incredibly potent.
Which is why the snake slivers on the ground and eats the dust.
So that's the first thing. Now, getting to the punishment of the snake, I think the point is to emphasize to man that there is going to be a part of you called the snake, and that's your animalistic tendency. And the making the snake eat of the dust of the ground and to sliver on the ground and stay as low to the ground as possible is to emphasize that that part of you is earthly. It eats the dirt, the earth. It comes from the earth. It's animalistic. It's earthly. There's nothing of the divine in that part.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's, if you're understanding the snake as symbolizing that lower animalistic drive, I think that's a beautiful perush to this punishment of the snake, right? It's emphasizing to us how lowly that is, and it kind of clarifies to us, while in the beginning of the story, it's evident that the snake was walking, right? By changing the snake from walking to slithering, it ends up making it clear to the readers of the story that, don't think that all of those temptations you have are coming from any glorified human side of you. They're coming from the lowest part, and that part is within you.
And which is why the snake is attacking the feet.
Exactly. So you said beautifully, and maybe you should say it because it wasn't my idea.
I mean, just basically that the snake attacks the feet, and then man's way of defeating the snake is by its head, by hitting it on its head, meaning using intelligence to defeat, like you mentioned, that part of the mind that can control the inclination.
Right, exactly. So we attack it from above.
Right, exactly.
From the mind, right.
And
then the snake is trying to get us from the bottom.
And any parting thoughts on any parting thoughts? Yeah, any parting thoughts on Adam Hava or anything else?
Yeah. Let's finish with their punishment or their thing. So to say again, it's a very human story, and it tells us a lot about humanity and how human civilization is going to be formed, and what are going to be the tendencies and the psychological concerns that all humans have. And I'm talking deeper psychological concerns. So the biggest psychological concern that a woman has is going to be her ability to survive, because she is put in a very precarious position in that she is competing with men for survival. So the biggest concern that a woman is going to have is going to be her own survival on this world. She doesn't have the muscle mass to compete with men for food. And when going out to war, she's going to be easy target, easy prey. All of these concerns are going to develop in Chava once she develops an ability to have concerns. Once she develops an imagination and an ability to develop anxieties, then she will start to have concerns about her present survivability, right? So the curse that she gets is more a ramification of her mind developing. Once the female mind develops, she looks at her body and she compares it to the man next to her and she says, holy moly, how do I survive? So she thinks of a plan. Well, she is going to have to cling to a man, because if she doesn't cling to a man, she's toast, right? And that is the part where your desire will be to your husband, but he will rule over you. That's very, very important, that the husband will dominate her. Now, it doesn't mean that he should dominate her. It means that he probably will. Because in the present, the woman is the needy one in the relationship. Even women tend to be a little bit more clinging to their husbands than the husbands are to the woman. And there's a deep psychological reason for that. It's not just a funny sociological occurrence. Right. It's because deep down, there is a much bigger concern that the woman won't be able to survive without the man, and the man won't be able to survive without the woman, right? So the woman needs to cling to the man in order to survive, because she's just not given the proper tools. Now, she does have this ability to give birth. In my previous shooting, I went into why the birth is also a ramification of this whole thing. And that's because we're talking about mortality, right? And if mortality is the prime subject of the story, then the ramification is that the emphasis is going to be around her ability to give birth, because that solves our mortality. Now, what the pain in childbirth means, maybe you could help me with it. Currently, I don't remember anything that I like too much on that topic.
Yeah, on that topic, I'm not exactly. So I'm sure I've read stuff on it before, but I'm sure there's a lot of analysis on it. I just can't remember.
Right. So what is important about the fact that she gives birth is that's going to be what she's known for, and that's going to be what defines her. And it defines her in more ways than you think, because it also contributes to her inability to survive. Because once she's in pain giving birth to kids, she becomes extraordinarily vulnerable. So she becomes extremely needy of a man to protect her. And that's just the way the world works. And it's part of our psychology, and it's part of our deeply rooted psychology. And it extends even to today, when women are much more self-sufficient. They will still be more clingy than their husbands are. And that's as a general rule. Right. And that's because of this, right? So that's a woman's punishment.
Well, in the ancient world, also, if a woman was, and I think the Torah is very clear about how we should treat orphans and widows. Because of this fact, we should protect them. We should always look out for them, because they didn't have that many tools for survival. So if they became kind of used in a way, in the eyes of men, and they had children, and they came up with a certain age, and now they feel like they're not useful anymore, men perceive them that way, they kind of become vulnerable in society. Some women would have to turn to harlotry. So there are all these rules in the Torah gives in order to protect women from that happening.
And that's part of the beauty of the Torah, that it's a constant response to the human problems that we have, right? A very basic human problem is that a woman without a man is very vulnerable. Not as much today,
right? But
definitely in the vast majority of civilizations throughout history, right? So how do you deal with that issue, which is brought up at the very beginning? People don't know it's brought up at the beginning because they're not reading the story with enough depth. But this issue of female vulnerability is the first thing we're taught of in the entire Torah. And then for the rest of the Torah, every single time we're including someone in some korban, it's the Ager v'hayatom v'ha'almana, right? The widow is included in every single thing.
Right.
Why? To respond to this fundamental problem, this issue.
It leads me to a more fundamental question. What is a woman? No, I'm kidding.
Right. But this also, it does play into that question, in that there are going to be very deep psychological differences between the male and the female based on their place in the ecosystem. The woman's place in the ecosystem is a much more precarious position. That's going to affect her psychologically,
Right.
So I think that's more on the topic of her punishment. And again, I don't know much about the pain involved. Now, one thing that's obvious is that I don't think animals could feel, I knew they could feel pain, but humans can augment pain through imagination.
Right.
So all of a sudden, the biggest pain that every female fears is that childbirth pain. But for an animal is kind of like a blip, like kind of the experience that we had when we got a Brit Milah. It's not enough of something that we can remember, so the pain doesn't stay with us. So because of the ability, the mind that the woman has developed, they can now augment that pain into something far greater, and that's the ultimate pain, because especially in those days, it came with a lot of mortality.
Right. They can.
I think this is actually the idea that I had thought of. This idea of what the pain means is that now that you're intelligent and you can imagine and you can augment things in your mind, so the fundamental fear of your pain is going to be even worse than it was before.
Yeah, and all your other pains that you've experienced and sufferings that you've experienced, you can project onto that fear and say like that, like you actually are counting down to the pain, whereas with an animal, it's just part of
exactly. With an animal, it's the same thing as getting a Brit Milah. How much did you suffer when you got Brit Milah? I know I did,
right? But
I don't remember it much. Right. Now the woman, how much did you suffer when you're giving birth? Oh, it's terrible, 24-hour labor, right? So yeah.
Yeah, and I think
so that would be the punishment of woman. It's all tied. And now again, the punishment isn't a punishment that happens after the fact. Right. It's a ramification of the female developing intelligence.
Right.
And
obviously separating us from the animals. This is another place that the Torah does that. What about the sweating of the brow?
So the man, his key to survival is going to be to earn a living. Now, unlike the animal kingdom, which because they can't imagine a future where they don't have food, there's nothing to really fret about. Animals don't develop severe anxiety and depression. Humans can. Now, the man is always going to be concerned with his present survival, right? And because he is the one who has to provide, or he has nobody to cling to like the woman does, so that's going to be his fundamental concern is, I need to survive here. But he has another concern, which is not only do I need to survive here, but I need my progeny. I need my name to live on, right? And that's why he links up with the woman. That's his incentive to link up with the woman, because otherwise she's just a burden.
Right.
If man doesn't get anything in that transaction, he's not doing it. He would rather just hunt for himself and feed one mouth instead of three, right? So that's going to be his incentive to work. Now, it's not going to be simple, because unlike the animals that go around and just eat whatever they find in the forest, the man is going to have this ability to worry and to have anxieties that project into the future. So what man is going to start to do is he's going to start to cultivate fields, so that not only could he produce for the here and now, or not only could he hunt for the here and now, but that he could create abundance for the future that he's so worried about. And that's going to be the toil that he's doing in the field, this constant toil. Now, we do it also, right? Why? You ever ask the question, why do billionaires continue working?
Right.
Maybe it's enjoyable, it gives them meaning and stuff, but there's another reason why we have this tendency to constantly want to amass more and more and more and more. Because by amassing more and more, it kind of assuages our concerns for our future. It's such a fundamental anxiety that we have, our mortality, that the more we amass, the more it rubs against that, or it assuages that concern, that natural anxiety. So that would be the anxiety that most defines man. That would be like these two anxieties, the anxiety of childbirth and the anxiety of men in their pursuit and work. Those are like the definitional anxieties, the core anxieties of the two genders.
Wow. Beautiful. That was unbelievable.
All right. So
and you could tell our audience where they could find you before you go.
The Parasha Podcast. The Parasha Podcast. It's on Apple Podcast and Spotify. I teach all of Tanakh. I mean, I'm not done with Tanakh, but I'm trying to teach most of Tanakh. So you could find the Navi Podcast, and you could find the Parasha Podcast, and you could find the Tehillim Podcast. Covering the three branches of Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. So that's where you could find me. And yeah, I mean, it was a pleasure being on. I guess we're concluding, right? Yeah,
we're concluding, and I'm gonna send you a copy, and then we'll we'll hopefully do this again.
Absolutely, would love to.
All right, thank you.
All right, Benji, thank you for the opportunity.
Take care. No problem.
Take care. Bye bye.